On September 11th, 1973, President Salvador Allende, the president of Chile, died under mysterious circumstances. He was in the middle of what was becoming a growing civil war. A coup had been launched by the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet. Now, Allende had been the president of Chile since 1970, when he was duly elected. No one questioned whether Allende had been elected in fair and free elections. He had been. Allende had legitimate authority to rule Chile as the president. However, Augusto Pinochet and the military, as well as many others, including the US government, were displeased with Allende because of his socialist politics, and so the military decided to remove him about 3 years after his election. With Allende's death, the conflict ended quickly, and Pinochet came to power and would rule as the president of Chile for the next 17 years without ever running in a legitimate election. On that fateful day in September of 1973, Salvador Allende had legitimate authority. He was the duly elected president. But what Allende lacked was the power to maintain that authority, the power to maintain his office. Meanwhile, Pinochet lacked legitimate authority. He staged a coup. But what Allende had, with the backing of the military and many other powerful people in this world, what Pinochet had was the power to take that office anyway. Now, if you were to pick up a poli-sci textbook, a political science textbook, and you were to look up these terms, authority and power, you would probably read paragraphs explaining to you that authority is a subset of power, that authority is a type of power. But the example of the conflict between Allende and Pinochet and many other examples from history clearly show, I think, that unfortunately, oftentimes, power and legitimate authority do not come together. They are not in any way identical, that far too often, those with legitimate authority lack power, and those with power lack and are not even interested in legitimate authority. Simply put, power is the ability to do what you want to do. Power is the ability to do what you decide to do, even if others oppose you. Real power is the ability to do to someone else whatever you want, even if they oppose you. We know power when we see it and when we experience it. I think legitimate authority is a little bit more difficult to define. It's a bit more tenuous, and it's certainly much more fragile. But as I've thought about it this week, it seems to me that while power is something that you can have and exercise over others, legitimate authority is really something that others give to you. If you have real authority, legitimate authority, what that means is you have the respect of other people. You have the trust of other people. In a sense, to have authority is to be the kind of person that other people want in power, whether you have the power or not. Now, our gospel passage today is, I think, really interesting. Jesus is just beginning his ministry, and he walks into a synagogue in pretty much his hometown, his home region. He grew up in Nazareth, but this town of Capernaum is nearby. And he begins to teach, and the people in the synagogue are amazed at Jesus's teachings. They're shocked, they're surprised. But they're not surprised by Jesus's rhetorical ability, like the way he speaks, although presumably Jesus was a pretty good public speaker. But that's not what they were amazed by. And they weren't amazed by the content of what he was saying. They weren't blown away by the arguments that he was making, although presumably he put together a well-crafted position. No, they were amazed by his authority. Jesus spoke as someone with authority, with that legitimate authority. They found themselves respecting and trusting him. They found themselves wanting Jesus to perhaps call some of the shots in their society. That's what impressed them. Finally, someone who spoke with legitimate authority. Now, first century Israel was a place that was not lacking in people of power. There were lots of powerful people in this society. Israel at this time, as many of you will know, was occupied by the Roman Empire. If you want to think of something powerful, it's hard to think of anything more powerful historically. Israel was overrun with Roman soldiers, centurions, and other military officers who had extraordinary power over the Jewish people they were ruling over. And indeed, there was a whole apparatus of government power, governors and prefects and other bureaucrats that ruled Israel in the interests of the Roman emperor. And of course, there were also religious figures who were quite powerful, priests, rabbis, and as we hear today, scribes, people with religious power. There was no shortage of powerful people in Jesus' day. And yet Mark suggests here that legitimate authority was much rarer because the people are so shocked to actually hear a teacher speak with authority. These people were used to powerful people in their midst. What they weren't used to was a teaching with genuine, legitimate authority. A society where there's lots of power but almost no legitimate authority is a society in crisis, I think. And it seems to me that our world, our society today in the 21st century is actually in many ways very similar to Israel. Our world is full of powerful people, presidents and prime ministers, CEOs, military leaders, and police. There's a huge number of very powerful people in our midst. How many of these people do we see as really having authority, though? That legitimate authority. How many politicians do you really look up to and you think, yeah, that person is really the best person for their office? Maybe some. My guess, though, is it's a small minority of the politicians you know about. How many CEOs do you think are really the right person to be making all the decisions that they're making? How many military leaders around the world? How many heads of the various police forces around the world do you think are really the right person? These powerful people, how many are really exercising legitimate authority? We'll disagree on our assessment, but my guess is that most of us would say only a small minority of those in power really have that legitimate authority that we would want them to have. Often those who call the shots in this world are not qualified morally and sometimes not qualified intellectually for the jobs they hold. They have power but not authority. And of course, the problem is that it isn't a problem for them. These powerful people continue to hold power year after year, decade after decade. Their lack of authority seems no obstacle to their maintaining power. Now, Jesus, I think, is the exact opposite of these leaders. Here is someone who, right out of the gate, people recognize as having heaps of legitimate authority. And yet, Jesus would spend his life with very little, if any, power, right? And that might seem odd for us Christians, because again, we say that in Jesus, God comes among us, that Jesus is God incarnate, God with us. And don't we also say that God is omnipotent? God is all-powerful? How could it be that an all-powerful God comes into the world as this Jesus, and yet he seems to utterly lack any power? This God certainly has plenty of legitimate authority, and that does make sense, but the lack of power may feel strange. And it's hard to deny, it's hard to ignore. Jesus ends his life on a cross, arrested, tortured, and executed by the people who really have power in his society, the Roman government. Jesus' lack of power could not be more obvious or more manifest than on Good Friday. And this may trouble us. How could it be that God incarnate is so powerless? But if we continue to reflect and think deeply about who we believe God to be, and if we reflect more honestly about the nature of power, this might actually not surprise us as much. As I've already suggested, power is often wielded by selfish people. Indeed, power is often wielded by sociopathic people. There's some good evidence coming out from the last few decades of research in political science that suggests that the percentage of people in positions of power who show signs of sociopathy is 4, 5, 10 times higher than the average population. And indeed, our folk wisdom teaches us this, right? I think most of us know the quote, "Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely." Now, again, I've done a little bit of reading around this lately, and there are some political scientists now who are arguing it might not so much be that power always corrupts us, so much as that power attracts people who are already easily corruptible. Political scientists debate this. Either way, though, the lesson, I think, is clear. Power intoxicates us, and we humans often abuse power when we hold it. We often wield our power not to build a more just and equitable and peaceful world. No, far too often. It seems more often than not, when we have power, we humans use it to bully other people into submission. Reflecting on that unpleasant truth, then, it might not surprise us that when God comes into the world, when God comes to us as God incarnate, Jesus, that this person actually doesn't wield all that much power. Because the God we know and worship and love and serve is not a God interested in bullying us into submission. No, our God is a God who is interested in that justice and equity and peace instead. The God who creates and sustains us out of love. The God who creates us and sustains us in order to give us the freedom to love. Such a God indeed must be full of legitimate authority. This is the sort of God we trust and respect, at least the sort of God I trust and respect. And yet, such a God actually would not be that interested in exercising power, at least not exercising power for the mere sake of exercising power. If power more than anything is the ability to coerce others, then ultimately we worship a God who is strangely omnipotent and yet profoundly uninterested in that power. But this gospel passage contains more than just a theological lesson about the abstract nature of God. In Jesus, yes, we see who God is, but in Jesus, we also see who we are called to be. Jesus is simultaneously a window onto God and a mirror reflecting us back to ourselves. And so Jesus is telling us, yes, this is who God is, but also this is who you are called to be. We too, then, might want to reflect deeply on how much of our time we spend developing, cultivating legitimate authority in our lives, and how much time we spend seeking raw power itself. And of course, the lesson seems to be it's that legitimate authority, that respect and trust of others that we need to be cultivating more than anything. Now, despite everything I've said so far, I don't mean to actually suggest that we can or even should avoid taking power in this world. Ultimately, we human beings can't do anything with our authority unless that authority is empowered. Yet, I hope that we can see from this lesson and from the lessons of our history that power can only be a force for good if it is a tool that we use. That power is only helpful if it is bridled by legitimate authority. Otherwise, if power becomes an end unto itself, power rapidly is transformed from a tool into a weapon. I think this is a lesson that every generation should pay attention to, but certainly today in 2024, living in the US, I think we need to reflect deeply on this. There are many voices in our nation today, it seems to me, that celebrate power, indeed that seem to worship power for the sake of power. There are political movements in our midst that are not concerned one bit with legitimate authority, with democracy or due process, but rather simply want more power for themselves so that they can reshape the nation in their own image, regardless of what impact that has on anyone else. The attempted coup in our country on January 6, 2021 showed that without a doubt. I'm glad that January 6th ended differently than September 11th, 1973 in Chile, but we would be fools to ignore the sign. I pray, though, that our nation can change paths, that other voices, that other priorities, that other values can prevail. I pray that our nation can actually learn from Jesus. Most people in this country say they want to learn from Jesus, and yet very often we don't seem interested in actually deep reflection on Jesus' teachings or example. I hope that our nation can come to accept the wisdom that power without legitimate authority is little more than a catapult to hell. My friends, I hope that we will hear this lesson and heed this lesson. May it be so. Amen.